So I would like to invite our friends, our friends, Vincente Alavapon. I don't need to introduce him because he was on the stage, was the regional head of DVB Bank. And Pong, okay, please. Paul, let me dig out your CV to introduce you. Sorry. Paul is the global head of aviation in Stevenson Harwood, and he's a broad experience in structure and residual finance, and he's called the king of low-cost carriers. I need to ask you that question. Okay, and David, where's David? David Nixon, head of IFC Asia Pacific. Mr. Nixon is overseeing the creation of IFC in Beijing and Singapore, and he used to be working in Airbus as a contract manager. So, welcome manager, welcome all the gentlemen coming on stage. We have a lot of interesting discussion this morning. We would like to bring this further because our topic today is risky business, the challenges ahead. Okay, so you see the relationship between me and all of you is a bit strange, you know. I was a client, right? But in the past we used to work together very closely. So let's make it a very free discussion. You don't need to bound by the questions that we had been put forward by the organizer, okay? It's good to you guys? But because the role is quite different, a banker, a lawyer, and operating Lessor senior, so we would like to start this by bringing up a keyword here, risk. So what do you think risk in this market are? What the most critical risk for nowadays?
Okay, I guess I will try to answer that question from the banker's perspective. I think a normal bank, a mainstream bank, we call it mainstream bank, but don't feel offended by that, Anup, would understand from the risk perspective when they look into aircraft aviation in specific, the credit of the airline, probably also the jurisdictional environment, and basically all, how can I say, qualitative elements which could actually affect an airline over the years. There's just one flaw with that sort of approach is any airline analysis will be more or less accurate for not more than 2 or 3 years. The airline business is so cyclical that it's almost impossible to have a more or less solid forecast for airline financial performance for more than 3 years. And if you look into these cycles in the past, cycles have been longer or shorter, but generally after every 5 to 7 years, some people say 10 years, there will be a downturn. So if you then compare that to the aircraft itself, the metal, so to speak, there have been also cycles, and they are of course highly correlated to the airline performance, but they are different. They are different, and they have a different pattern. And one of the most important ones, if I may start on that, is essentially that the aircraft are movable assets, and they can move from A to B. They're global assets. A lot of airline crises have been regionally, have affected regions. So therefore, even though of course we have in more recent past seen some global crises as well, but even during the 2008 and 2009 liquidity crisis, there have been regions, and Asia one of them, who have been actually fairly stable during that crisis. It was more the US markets and the European markets which were affected. If you look at some of the data points, even which we saw this morning, it was amazing to see how quickly, in fact, then also the US markets actually recovered, whereas the European markets are still hovering around. So to come back to my point, what we at DVB look at is primarily the aircraft risk and the related risk around actually how you manage the aircraft, what can you do to protect your interest in the aircraft, and then look at that. That doesn't mean that we completely disregard the credit risk as well, because it continues to be quite important. But managing aircraft is top priority at DVB. I think the second priority is then probably the jurisdictional risk, because you can have a great aircraft sitting somewhere, but if you can move it, there will be a problem as well. So jurisdictional risk is probably second priority, sorry. And then third priority is probably credit for us. And so just to also manage that risk, essentially. But that's roughly how we actually look at risk.
So David, do you agree? Because you are also a kind of financier. It's different from bank, but do you agree with Vicente about this kind of things?
I think maybe partly because of my background and then partly because of the difference of an operating lessor and a bank. We tend to look at risk more as an asset-based decision. So aircraft are obviously a global asset, probably the most portable asset around, and very easy to transfer from one market to the other, given some complications in there. So we see asset risk being applied differently for different types of aircraft and different ages of aircraft into specific markets, and then we manage those risks accordingly. We try to play in all sectors of the market. We try to be in the emerging and developing markets. We try to be with the mainline flag carriers, and we'll apply different assets to those situations and manage our risk, not just through a credit evaluation of the customer, but also through the type of asset we play there. We do that with a global presence. We have a team in Europe, we have a team in the US, and we have a team in Asia that are working with our customers constantly to find the best fit for whichever airplane we have.
Okay, so Paul, your turn. You should protect your customer from risk.
Interesting that you said that, because we do act for carriers, for banks, and for lessors. So, I mean, I think there's no business that is without risk. So for us, it's a question of risk allocation. So we normally try, when we're acting for our customers, to allocate the risk to the person who's best able to manage it. This is the general rule. And then, depending on the commercial transaction, what is the deal that has been struck? So what risk has been allocated to the carrier or to the lessor for that pricing that they've agreed to pay. The way I see it is that there are essentially three risks, the third of which can be broken down into smaller portions. That's asset risk. I think that's quite well managed generally, because if you choose the correct aircraft, I mean, it's quite established as to how the rules with regard to maintenance, and we have some of the best MRO facilities in Asia. And insurance, of course. Insurance covers quite a lot of the damage and loss risk. There's credit risk. I can't help on that. The banks or the lessors will take their view with looking at historic accounts and from their analysts as to what's the credit risk of the carrier or the lessor that they are lending to. But the last risk, which is enforcement risk, which comes back to Vicente's point about jurisdiction, I think that's, I'll just say a few things about that. Enforcement risk, I think, can be broken up into two. One is default risk, and the other is insolvency risk. So if there's a default, how likely are you to be able to exercise your rights and remedies and correctly? So it's, this is an asset that flies all around the world, and not surprisingly, the laws of the different countries that aircraft flies into are different. And so the laws with regard to the rights of a mortgagee, owner, are different in different countries. And that gets more complicated when your credit goes insolvent. The bright light in all this is that there is the Cape Town Convention. It's a very important convention. In fact, I think in aviation we underestimate the importance of that convention, because for movable assets, no other asset has that has an equivalent convention. So it essentially elevates aircraft assets to a special level. Shipping doesn't have it, trains don't have it, buses don't have it. So what that does is, for all Cape Town countries, it applies a consistent, common approach to what are the rights of owners and owners, stroke lessors, and lenders as mortgagees. That's very powerful, and I think that with Cape Town, many new financing products, not new, but many financing products available in many parts of the world will become more available, and we spoke about capital market products. And I think that will be the sort of the bedrock for us for the bankers and the clever lessors to structure new deals.
So Vicente, how important to you on Cape Town? Is it something which you really bet on? Is so important that you can save 100 basis point on your margin by offering a Cape Town carrier? That's
a very good question. I think everyone expected when Cape Town Convention started to be introduced in Asia, and specifically in Indonesia, I think was one of the first ones, and then a few others, that all the banks would immediately give some real credit to it. And I think the banks actually do, but it's almost like more a tick the box type of thing you want to have. In reality, I think giving substantial concessions on pricing never really happened. I think it happened on Exim Bank and ECA financing, if I remember correctly. The thing is, we don't actually really do ECA financing. But in terms of pricing commercial transactions, there was no real concession provided to the airlines. It was more really, I wouldn't say nice to have, but it's more than nice to have. It is important to have, but it didn't have the same or the impact everyone was expecting it to have. More importantly, and every jurisdiction is different, it really then comes down to the details. I agree with Paul that it is very important to have it, and I think it has opened a lot of other opportunities, or actually opportunities in jurisdictions where before lenders in particular, but maybe also some of the source, were reluctant to do business. So it has definitely opened up markets, and I think Indonesia is probably the main market I can think of. India, perhaps China, not really, because credit's also quite good. So I think it comes down then to the very specific country where you can then actually gain some additional benefit out of this. And then I will leave it rather to Paul to say whether the legal analysis is really then beneficial to each and every case. Ideally, yes, it is Chapter 11 comparable, and that would be great, but I think whenever you then do a specific transaction in a Cape Town jurisdiction, there will be something else which pops up in where you think, well, it's not really Chapter 1110, right? So I think, yes, it does help. It has helped in particular opening new markets, I think. Not on a big scale, I would think, but rather on a smaller scale. But maybe to mention also one example, on our side, we have, because of Cape Town Convention, also done early this year a transaction where we have provided a loan into a Chinese borrower in China. And there are a lot of legal issues with borrowing or actually lending into a Chinese SPC. But Cape Town essentially gave us the comfort actually to do so.
Okay, so David, recently IFC decided to open offices in Asia. That's new. This is something a marketing-driven thing, or is a risk-driven thing?
So, IFC had a pretty big change of management a couple of years ago, and the team that's come in has made a decision to be more present, be actually out with our customers, not only from a marketing perspective, but also so that we can monitor risks and react to them. Because Cape Town's an ultimate sort of solution, but the best situation is actually to know what's going on with your customers and work with them on a day-to-day basis, so that you avoid situations where you're dealing with the legal authorities and removing an aircraft. So we have built up an office in Amsterdam, we have built up an office in Singapore, we've built up an office in Beijing. in addition to our presence in Los Angeles, really to allow us a better presence and a better market understanding and position ourselves better.
Okay, there are so many aircraft leased from IFC to Asia and China in the past. So this is something now, a different approach of the company on the market. So any more offices that you'll be planning, in Asia?
No, I don't think we'll be quite as prolific as maybe our major competitor has in producing offices around the world. But it is a different approach for LFC, but it's also a different market, a different presence of leasing companies. I think someone mentioned earlier today that there were 40 commercial aircraft lessors in the world today. There's 17 in China. So it's a much more competitive environment. I think it requires more local understanding in order to optimize and find the best deals. So it's a different world than it was when Steve Hazy and his team started their business. And we think we're better positioned to deal with it by having these regional offices.
Okay. So Paul, since that you have a lot of businesses in the coming days, right?
Actually, LFC just took one of my senior associates, so not too many offices, otherwise I lose too many lawyers.
But maybe to add to Dave's point, I think what you're essentially saying, Dave, is you have to be close to the customer. And I think that is a very important point for risk management as well. I mean, if you do a transaction with an airline, whether it's an operating lease or a loan transaction, and you close the deal, you put the file into the shelf, and you forget about it, that's not how you can solve risk in the future. And I'm not talking about a credit risk, I'm talking about the other risks which you have mentioned in the past. And I think most of the lessors have done actually quite a good job in doing so. And they are very close to their customers. They see them probably on a monthly basis, some of them maybe even on a weekly basis, the ones which require some risk management, active risk management. So I think that is very, very important, and it's also a message basically to everyone who does aircraft financing or leasing. I mean, being close to the customers is very, very important.
Yeah, we have also heard in the previous sessions that there will be a peak of deliveries in the coming years, and it seems that with the European prices, the liquidity is tightened. So what will be the advice you would like to provide to your own customers, like airlines, like Spring Airlines? How can we, what is the best approach for us to do things in the coming few years in order to mitigate our risk?
First of all, you have to do business with BVB, of course. And then secondly, no, I think probably most importantly, spread your risk. Basically, don't put your eggs into one basket. Try to come up with a plan where you can spread your risk in terms of funding sources. And you're the master of that, Johnny. So I don't have to tell you that, but for the others, that's really what I think airlines should be doing. Spread your risk, talk to the people in the market. And there are banks, lessors, insurance companies, we haven't really mentioned that today, insurance companies, pension funds going out, they also wanted to employ the funds. They have surplus funds because simply they don't invest into the equity markets anymore, they're too volatile. Really try to spread your wings into the different sources of funding. And to do so, obviously, you have to be more global. You have to look beyond your own borders. Being in Asia at the moment is probably a good thing to do so because there's a lot of liquidity in the market. But I think really diversifying of your funding sources is probably the key.
Any advice from a leading law firm?
I don't provide the money, sadly, so I'm only talking vicariously. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that diversity is creates value actually in terms of your ability to weather movements in the market. But there's an interesting movement going on right now that I've observed, which is not dissimilar to property finance. So aviation is also an asset. Aviation assets are aviation. So you have seen in the market REITs, for example, where they split the ownership of the asset into a separate company from the operations of the asset. And some airlines are already doing that. But airlines who have both ownership and operations intertwined into one entity could look to find value in doing that split into an ownership entity and a leasing entity, creating more value by splitting the two. Yeah, it creates problems for financing as well initially, but in the long run, there is some value in doing that. Yeah.
So you are saying that airlines should set up their own leasing companies, or
not to compete with ILFC, obviously, but that has proven to work for property companies where they've split both, and the ownership entity then can go off and source its own financing, and the operational entity continues to do what it's good at, which is operate the asset.
I see what you mean.
No, I think the point is actually, or the idea is a good one to translate it into the aviation industry. And there have been some cases done in the past. Unfortunately, the airline which did it probably most professionally went bankrupt, but not because of that idea, which was Swiss Air. But I mean,
and Oasis.
Okay, Oasis and Hong, it's home to you, close to your heart, Johnny. But I think, and also if you look into the fundamentals of aircraft financing, funding a lessor has been in the past easier actually than funding an airline, especially if it is weaker airlines. So by splitting the ownership into an ownership company and an airline company, you could then basically start raising your funding at the ownership company level. But it may erode, obviously, also the substance of an airline. So I think there are two different schools of thought when we talk about this, and I think no one is really right or wrong. But it's an interesting idea, definitely.
I'm going to take a little different view on that. I think for obvious reasons. But an aircraft is a complex asset, and the maintenance implications are extremely costly. The choice of even the configuration on an aircraft can greatly affect its value. So I like the idea of sticking with what you're good at, and if you're an airline, you're good at moving passengers. And as we've seen and we've talked about, aircraft are global assets. They're easy to move around if you have the expertise to do it. So if you're an airline and you're looking for a way to mitigate your risk, and you're looking for
both Boeing and Airbus, but of course we are also welcoming MRJs, C series or C919s. So David, what's your viewpoint? By now there are so many new aircraft types, not maybe major types, maybe subtypes coming up. How can we position ourselves in this kind of very tricky position?
So ILFC owns around 1,000 commercial aircraft, about half from Boeing and half from Airbus. Current generation aircraft that are in operations with carriers all over the world. But as we've looked at where we want to go and what we want to do in the future, we've focused on new high fuel efficiency products. So we're very focused on A320neos, on 787, on A350, and we see those as the future. These are the kind of new aircraft that we're offering into the market now. In terms of current generation airplanes, we're pretty conservative on what we buy and transact there. So, while there is plenty of room, there's still plenty of room to operate those aircraft. There's a big, significant risk in the long term what the residual value of those assets is going to be and what the end-of-life solutions for them are. So we tend to focus on new airplanes. We have a substantial fleet of used aircraft that we market quite successfully. But in terms of changing technologies, I would put my new money on the new airplanes.
So Paul, did you help some of your customers purchasing new engine aircraft?
It's no secret. We acted on the Lion Air, the gigantic order, which I must give credit to Boeing. It's a difficult deal, was fantastic to be able to.
Can you share with us what are those hot points during negotiations? You don't need to tell us the result, just tell us what the areas that are being discussed.
Why do I just speak generally about purchase agreements? I guess, the three top points in any purchase agreement is price. Price is one. um, price is one, ability to be able to obviously get financing to be able to buy the aircraft when it occurs, and how you mitigate in the event that you end up when the time of delivery occurs. And many people have spoken, including Martin, that aircraft gets delivered at the bottom of the market. How do you mitigate
so
against
nothing
that?
concerning the new engines is common to every purchase contract, right? So
right. You're asking anything particular to the new engines?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm afraid I can't talk that much about that.
That's fine.
But I'll just complete. I mean, the first is obviously price, and price is a component of several things: the base price, the escalation, how you calculate it, and under what circumstances does the escalation change. I mean, that's common. The second part is what happens if you do actually get the nightmare scenario where you order in good times and you deliver in bad times. So someone will need to talk to your manufacturer as to when that happens, what are your options available? And it's no secret again, the options that are available are things like conversion, right to convert, right to schedule. And those are very difficult topics for the manufacturer to discuss, and possibly even some backstop, which is a difficult issue. And I think lastly is the customization process, which actually takes up a lot of time, and how much that costs, because those are unknowns going into the future. How that process is managed.
So, Vincent, are you concerned that you need to repossess a classic aircraft when the new engine option had come up in 2017-18? So how do you deal with it?
The Neo introduction has caused definitely a lot of discussion among, I think not only us at DVB, but quite a few banks, and I'm sure also Lessors, on the potential impact on the residual values for the existing fleet. We have done quite a lot of extensive research on basically older aircraft types and try to reconcile the developments on residual values when, for instance, the next generation aircraft were introduced in the late 90s and the impact on the 300s and the classics. And there's a considerable, there was a considerable impact on residual values. The value curve essentially is becoming much steeper, where I think a lot of people assume something like a 5% depreciation per year, so in other words 20 years depreciation curve. We have seen in this analysis that the depreciation actually increases to 6-7%, which then really brings down the economic useful life quite a bit. And we do expect similar things to happen when the Neo gets introduced. I'm sure that Airbus will argue differently, because there is also a very wide population of CEOs in the market, and there's no question that it will take some time for this impact to materialize. But we are concerned, and we've seen, I think some lessors, including LC, actually changed their depreciation policy last year, I think, on some of the aircraft types. And you may have also had other reasons for that. But we are concerned, and clearly, again, drawing the comparison to classic Boeing aircraft to next generation, there have been issues just really trying to, well, not when you repossess, but rather really materialize the value in the aircraft which you thought at the beginning. That turned out to be wrong, or not wrong, but definitely quite different from what we thought. So we are definitely concerned, but we're also a bank, so we have to paint a more pessimistic view on this. But I don't know, Dave, what do you?
Yeah, we'll actually try to sell more of the existing portfolio to the secondary market because of this situation.
So LCCs acquired a company called AeroTurbo recently to manage our sort of end-of-life solutions for aircraft, and that's probably our biggest long-term play in dealing with assets as they reach the end of their life. I mean, you mentioned in your speech earlier that Spring is focused on the next generation of aircraft, and for the short term, you'll be leasing. That market between now and when NEOs start to become readily available in 2018, 2019, is going to be pretty well filled with A320s, 737, 800s with current generation aircraft. And I think we heard Brian Hogan earlier mention just the pricing impact of that. So there's opportunities in the market today to bridge. I think those opportunities come from a lot of my competitors, and certainly comes from ILFC with our existing portfolio. And then the longer term solution, we see the investment really in new generation, new technology.
Mm-hmm. Or do you see more activities recently for portfolio sale because of the different appetite of the risk of aircraft?
I think that's, well, there is appetite for portfolio acquisitions from Asia, in particular Japan, who have been quite active in the bids for the aircraft leasing companies that have been tendered either as a company or parts of their company. Yes, I think that there is more to come, especially where a lot of the liquidity is in Asia, looking to park that money somewhere where it's higher yielding, safe and good assets long term, when it's very hard to find such assets or such yields in the market easily. But I think generally you'll find it from the people who already have a fleet of aircraft themselves or are already managing and want to expand quickly into this market because they see an opportunity to get up in the rankings quickly. Yes.
Or something else, like will some of your airline customers release the aircraft up to the point that the new engine option will come up, or actually they don't care?
I mean, I've been very fortunate with some of our airline clients that, I mean, they have such sort of lofty expansion plans that the aircraft would just be put into service. I mean, because their expansion plans are staggering, and I barely can keep up with the number of aircraft they're delivering monthly, and their market is growing. So I think I don't know how much they are thinking in 2017. What do I do with my NGs or my regular A320s when the NEOs come? It could be a replacement for their existing aircraft. It could be just put into service to absorb the extra passenger traffic that is there. But at the moment, I mean, it's planning for such sort of tremendous expansion that it will just be put into service for themselves to use.
Related topic about the aircraft values, we just mentioned. We also heard from Robert that the escalation will come up if inflation goes up, right? So there'll be a gap between the second-hand market value of the aircraft and the new aircraft. So as a banker, you will be able to see a lot of things that are happening in the market. So, but as an airline, we don't. In order to go for a decision, whether to release the old aircraft versus to get a new aircraft, what's the advice?
It's a very difficult one. I think it's all about timing at the end of the day, like so many other things. We get this question actually quite often, and also just recently we had, actually this week we had another discussion with an airline about this. If you order an aircraft now, especially a neo aircraft, you will not get any delivery positions until I think 2018 or 19, the earliest. I mean, you saw the slides on how many, what the backlog for the neo is. So if you ink the purchase agreement today, escalation for 6-7 years, that can be, if I may say, a killer. I think that is definitely a very tough decision to make. On the other hand, if you want to expand, if you want to grow, you probably don't have any choice but actually going for such orders, depending on your timing, again, in terms of aircraft introduction. I think to some extent the people who have the aspiring business plans, and I'm sure that Paul is quite close to these people, these airlines, have made their decisions already, and they probably have done their homework very well. So definitely credits to them. The people, the airlines who want to take a decision now, they may have lost the train, they've missed the train, so to speak. So it's a tough one, and I would rather, from a pure risk management point of view, I would rather say keep basically your older aircraft, even though they may not be operationally so efficient, they may be more expensive to operate, but capital cost is the most important cost factor, probably besides fuel, in an airline. And if you don't have that under control, it can really affect you in a very, very significant way. Then that is a bit black and white. I'm sure that there's also probably a middle way, but that would be my advice to an airline in today's market, and even more so, there should be good opportunities now to buy second-hand aircraft, right? So they may not be as shiny, they may not be as, they can be clean, right? I think they can be same clean, but I think that could be a good option. I see also in Asia there's a bit of a perception that you have to have new aircraft. It's new, shiny. An aircraft has an economic useful life of 20 years, so it doesn't really hurt buying 6-7-year-old aircraft.
I want to jump on that a little bit because we see a lot of value in fleets of used aircraft. But traditionally the problem is if you are trying to expand or grow, you're going to do it with more than one airplane. So you don't want to have one airplane from several different operators in your fleet because that can cause you operational problems, it can cause you maintenance problems. We've been able to find some solutions recently, one that was announced with AirAsia X, where we've taken entire fleets of airplanes, in this case A330-300s, from another Asian operator, and moved them into AirAsia X as a fleet. This is a very effective way that's planned in advance, where the airplanes are basically sister ships, similar operations, and at used aircraft values rather than paying for the manufacturer's new price. Less residual value risk, more depreciation on the asset when it starts, equals a better lease rate for the customer. There are definitely opportunities for this sort of thing, especially when you're working with a leasing company that has a big portfolio of airplanes and a lot of different opportunities. So we see that as one of our critical market advantages when we go into these sorts of markets. And we have been successful in placing used airplanes in places that weren't imaginable even a few years ago. We just put an A330 into a mainland Chinese operator that was 10 years old. And it looks just like it is.
Yeah, but David, I'm not sure you know, DBB is actually quite good at also breaking down the aircraft for better value. I've not seen so much happening between such kind of operation and the leasing companies, apart maybe from GCAS. Most of your clients in that area are airlines. But do you think that when you have more and more aging portfolio, you'll be able to use some of these services?
Well, this is exactly why about a year ago ILFC acquired a company called AeroTurbine. And AeroTurbine is expert in the field of taking older aircraft and turning them into parts.
Oh, it's not only engines, it's also aircraft.
The entire aircraft.
Okay, I see.
So they are an integral part of our business now. In fact, my office in Singapore is co-located with the head of AeroTurbine's Asian operations. And we work together with them to find end-of-life solutions, to find solutions where maybe we put in or we remove some older assets and put in some newer ones. This is a critical part of our business, and we think it's quite strategic.
So it's not only self-serving, but also third-party businesses as well.
Dealing with our own assets, we have a large fleet. We can deal with other parties' assets where it makes sense. And AeroTurbine, of course, continues their normal operation, which is with anybody and everybody in the industry.
Okay. Competitive.
Yeah, no. We talk with competitors, no problem.
Any questions from the floor for our panelists?
I think it's happy hour.
Hi, Peter.
I'm sort of interested in and this applies to the last 2 days of the conference as well, that no one has actually talked about the direct impact of the environment. And I know a lot of the thinking has been factored into everything that we're doing now, but obviously we're running up to some real issues with the EU ETS and the opposition to that from governments around the world, and some of the retaliation, for example, by the Russians and so forth about overflights. But I just wonder, in terms of the impact of that, sooner or later something like the EU ETS will, trading system will come into place, perhaps on a global basis. And also, presumably, the cost of carbon credits is going to rise again, which will create greater pressure on airlines to be more fuel efficient. I mean, they want to be fuel efficient anyway, so it's sort of synchronous with the whole operating environment. But do you, I'd be just interested to know if you see this as maybe looking 3 or 4 years down the track as we start to come out, hopefully, of the economic doldrums and the cost of carbon credits go up, that you'll see an accelerated rate of replacement? Is that something you're factoring into to your thinking, both from a banking and a lessor's point of view?
I can maybe start, or try to start an answer. We did some analysis on that a few years ago. Came to the conclusion it's very difficult really to put a price tag on this, because I mean no one really knows how it will affect. People know it will affect somehow the potential residual values on aircraft, especially older aircraft. But where's the benchmark? You don't know. I mean, it's a bit like you're stepping in the fog around and trying to find something. We think long term there will be an issue, and it will affect especially older aircraft. And it will have a direct impact on the aircraft residual value as well, because if the cost element, I mean, it's just another cost to operating an aircraft, whether it's fuel, personnel, what have you, it will add to the cost base of an airline, and that the proportion of that cost, additional cost, so the marginal cost, so to speak, for the ETS scheme, will then determine how bad it will affect certain aircraft types. So you could actually break it down even into aircraft types. But it's probably a bit too early to say, even more so that you see quite a reluctance from Asian airlines to comply with the ETS scheme.
I'd add that we see different environmental regulation and different environmental issues in different regions. You mentioned Europe versus Asia, but aircraft being a truly global asset, you can apply them into the region where it is the most favorable. But clearly, in the long term, the fuel efficiency and the less fuel the airplane burns, the less emissions it's going to put out, and that's one of the reasons that we're focused on buying really the next generation of airplanes.
I think you're right to say that, because carbon credits are quite low right now, so they are less of an issue. But I guess in Asia we don't have an equivalent EU ETS scheme, so that's not in the forefront of the minds of many of the carriers, other than the ones that do long haul to Europe, who already have put in place the method of calculating what that EU ETS cost is going to be. I think that's right. So it's not in the forefront of people's mind, but it could be if carbon, the cost of carbon dioxide per ton goes up. On the legal side, actually, it shouldn't be underestimated, because the powers of the relevant environmental agencies in the countries are quite, in some countries, are quite draconian. For example, the EU, for example, the UK, where they actually have the right to firstly to terminate your ability to fly in that country, but more importantly, ability to seize aircraft. Something akin to Eurocontrol. So in the new documentation that we've been preparing there for lessors and for lenders, we have these provisions which require strict compliance. So the consequences of not complying are actually quite draconian. So they are to be sort of ignored at the peril of the carrier.
Any more questions from the floor? Robert? I know you ask questions.
I can't let Vincente get away with his first comment without asking to go back to Vincente.
Yes.
If I remember what you said correctly, you said that the first risk issue you look at is the aircraft, correct?
No, the first.
Yeah, first.
Yes.
Yeah. When you price your facilities, do you price the airline credit or the aircraft risk?
We're at the end of the day, good question. We're at the end of the day, we are a bank. So we do price, of course, the airline risk. But in combination with the aircraft risk as well, that's what we call the advanced approach under Basel II. It will be interesting to see once we all know the details of Basel III, whether we can continue doing that. We would hope so. We think so. The trend is definitely more towards an asset-based financing, I think even with mainstream banks. But you're right that under the regulatory requirements of banks, yes, we have to price in the airline risk.
And maybe just to follow up, not directly related, just for everyone's benefit here, when do you see most of the players who finance aircraft here in the Asian markets adopting Basel III?
Oh, it's an interesting one as well. I think we touched upon that a bit earlier, I think also in your presentation. I think it will probably take really some time, and when you ask Asian banks, I mean, you always get a completely different answer. I have also received answers where, and I don't remember whether it was actually Taiwan or even China, where they have implemented Basel III. And then you wonder, well, how can they then price certain transactions so favorably? So the honest answer is, I don't know. I really don't know. It's a very fragmented market, strangely, even though Basel III is supposed to be internationally standardized. I think one of the other things which may have an impact is simply, and there's nothing to do with Basel III, but rather access to funding. I mean, Chinese banks have a lot of, Chinese or Asian banks in particular, have a lot of different funding sources, retail banks, depositories, whatever. We shouldn't forget that a lot of Western banks have probably lost these funding sources, or a portion of these funding sources, which have just increased the cost for European banks. And we are a European bank as well. And yeah, I can be quite open here. Our funding costs have probably doubled, at least, well, minimum doubled over the last couple of years. That's probably one of the material differences. So it may not be actually Basel III or other regulatory requirements. Maybe simply, very simple, funding sources and cost of funding for the Asian banks. And there is a lot of liquidity out there, and that's why Asian banks, even though they may apply already Basel III, a very, very, I would say in the past, maybe the funding cost element into your pricing was a very small element, probably, I wouldn't say zero, but I mean 5–10%. Now it's probably 80%. And that's, I think, what is probably the issue, really.
Robert, I tell you, with 50% LTV, all the airlines are same for them. Same pricing. Sorry. Peter.
You're not so wrong.
When lenders do price, they look at the credit quite intensively. With the growth in Asia being quite substantial, how do lenders actually reflect, say, doing the credit analysis, that apart from the financial statements, the other risk, let's say, can they get sufficient crews, pilots, cabin crew into their fleet to actually support the growth? Let's say somebody gets another 50 or whatever, 100 aircraft in their fleet, they need an enormous crew. Do you as a lender, maybe DVB less than others, but to what extent is that reflected in the credit analysis? And on a country level, ditto to, say, ATC, is that an element in your credit assessment?
To be perfectly honest, I don't think so. I don't think so. That is something which is, I think, an important issue, especially going forward. And we haven't really touched upon that. Basically, the resource, a lack of resources, necessary resources to actually to support all this growth in Asia. I don't think that analysis is really done in detail, but it is a substantial issue.
I think that if you're looking at it from a Euro-US analysis of an airline, where the employment cost, I think, comes in second after fuel. Asian carriers, and this, Johnny can tell me otherwise, but employment costs are quite low down actually. There are other costs, like leasing costs or financing costs are quite high up. So the dynamics of an Asian carrier is slightly different from a sort of Western Euro carrier. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it's not primary. Well, I don't know.
No, it's a good point. I think personnel cost is a completely different, or has a completely different impact in Europe and in the US than here. And that's probably one of the major reasons why Asian airlines overall are still doing reasonably well.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. Maybe I ask the three panelists a final question. Can you specify the greatest challenge to airlines where you consider in the next 5 years, and the greatest challenge of your own business in the next 5 years?
The greatest challenge to airlines in the next 5 years. I keep going back to assets because that's where I come from. But I think making the best decision on the assets that are going to benefit your operation is probably pretty important. And mitigating the risks of those assets over the long term is going to be critical to the airline. And that's much the same challenge as ILFC has been going through in optimizing our portfolio of aircraft. I'd say that's one of our challenges that we're actively dealing with.
Again, I'm speaking vicariously. I would go for the two biggest cost items in the carrier, since I act for quite a few low-cost carriers. It would be fuel, management of fuel, and management of financing and leasing costs.
The greatest challenges I see for airlines in Asia is really managing the capacity in an intelligent way. That is, I think, going to be quite important. I know there's a growth story in Asia, and it should support much of this capacity growth as well. But I think there are still some, probably, I wouldn't say last minute surprises, but I think there will be some surprises, and to manage these surprises will be a challenge. For our business to manage all the biggest challenges or potential risk is, I think, being a European bank is really the whole access to liquidity point that continues to be quite a challenge for a European bank, and it also affects CBD.
Okay, thank you. Maybe to conclude, I would like to give one comment by myself. I attended these conferences for many years. Like in 1996, when we had the first conference in Beijing, I've seen a different group of people, but there are people who have been into Beijing, still working in this market. So aviation is a risky business, everybody knows. So somebody will be, will leave the market, somebody will come in the market. It's a matter of cycle, it's a matter of ups and downs. But if you would like to survive or you'd like to be successful, there are some ways that you can just weather through all this risk. So looking ahead, my point is still very positive, in particular for Asia. The market is huge, a lot of potential for everybody, leasing company, law firms, banks, airlines to make money. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so
Good to see you.